Book 3, Chapter 3 of Strangers and Pilgrims by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 3, Chapter 3. Lorsqu'un homme s'ennuie et qu'il sent qu'il est las de traîner le boulet au bagne d'ici-bas, dès qu'il fait sauter, qu'importe la manière. Elizabeth's manner that evening was just a little colder and quieter than usual. No unwonted flutter of her spirits betrayed the fact that the current of her life had been suddenly turned into a new channel. She had suffered her lover to accompany her to the edge of that suburb in which the Boroughbridge road was situated, and had there dismissed him. "I may come and see you to-morrow, mayn't I?" he pleaded. He had been trying to make her fix an early date for their marriage all the way along the dusky lane. "We must be married and have our wedding tour over before the Derby, you know," he said persuasively. "You don't care much about the touring business, do you? I'm sure I don't. I never could understand why newly married people should be sent to stare at mountains and do penance in musty old cathedrals, as if they'd done something wicked and were obliged to work it out somehow before they could get absolution. A week at Malvern would be about our figure, or if we had tolerable weather I could take you as far as Malta in the Pixie." "You are in a great hurry to settle matters. But when I promised to marry you, you know, I said nothing about the date of our marriage." "Oh, but that goes without saying. I've served my apprenticeship. You're not going to turn round upon me like Laban and offer me one of your sisters, or make me work 7 years longer. And if you've made up your mind to marry me, it can't matter to you whether it's soon or late." "What will Lady Paulyn say?" asked Elizabeth, with a little laugh. There was something pleasant in the idea of that wily matron's mortification. "My mother will be rabid," said the dutiful son. "But so she would whomsoever I married, unless it was for bullion. It was a good joke, her coming to try and choke you off with that story about Sarah Ramsay. Yes, my mother will be riled." "And Miss Disney? Do you think she will be pleased?" The Viscount was not so prompt in his answer this time. "Hilda," he said meditatively. "Well, I don't know. I suppose she'll be rather glad. It'll give her a home, you see, by and by, when my mother goes off the hooks. She couldn't have lived with me if I'd been single." "Oh, of course not. We shall have Miss Disney to live with us then, by and by." "Well, in the natural course of events, yes. My mother can't go on nursing the Ashcombe estate till the Day of Judgment, though I've no doubt she'd like very much to do it. And when she's dead, and all that kind of thing," continued his lordship pleasantly, "Hilda can have an attic and a knife and fork with us, unless she marries in the interim, and I don't think that's likely." "She looks rather like a person who has had what people call a disappointment," suggested Elizabeth, wincing a little as she remembered her own disappointment. "She came into the world with a disappointment," replied Lord Paulyn. "Her mother ate the sour grapes, and her teeth were set on edge. Her father, Colonel Disney, was heir presumptive to a great estate when my Aunt Sibylla married him. But when his uncle died, 6 months after the Colonel's marriage, a claimant sprang up with a rigmarole story of a Scotch marriage and no end of documentary evidence, the upshot of which was that after a good deal of Scotch law, and pursuing and defending so on, the claimant, a black-muzzled lad with the dip of the tar-brush, walked over the course, and Hilda's father was left with a large fortune in the hands of the Jews, in the shape of post-obits and accommodation bills. He ran away with a French opera dancer soon afterwards in a fit of disgust with society. My aunt and Hilda were left to drag on somehow upon a pittance, which my grandfather, a stingy old beggar, had settled upon his daughter when she married. When my aunt died, Hilda came to live with my mother, and has had a very pleasant time of it ever since, I make no doubt." They parted at the beginning of the villas that were dotted along the first half-mile or so of the Boroughbridge road, giving a trim suburban aspect to this side of Hawleigh. There were even gas lamps, macadam, and a general aspect of inhabitedness very different from the narrow lanes and rugged common on the other side of the town. This new neighbourhood was the west end of Hawleigh. "I shall come to see you to-morrow," repeated Lord Paulyn, reluctant to depart. "And mind, everything must be over and done with before May. Do you remember the first Derby we were at together? Nearly 2 years ago. Jolly, wasn't it? I've got a new team for the drag, spankers. I've set my heart upon your seeing young England a win. Hadn't you better write to Mrs. Chevenix? She's the woman to do our business. If you trust everything to your sisters, there'll be a 12-month muddling about it." "We have plenty of time for discussing these arrangements without standing in the high road to do so," said Elizabeth impatiently. "If I'd known you were going to worry me, I should have never said what I did just now. After all, it was only said on the impulse of the moment. I may change my mind to-morrow morning." "Oh no, you won't. I won't stand anything of that kind. I'm not like that parson fellow. Once having got you, I mean to keep you. I think I deserve some reward for holding on as I've done. You mustn't talk any more about throwing me over. That's past and done with." "Then you mustn't worry me," said Elizabeth, with a faint sigh of utter weariness. "So now, good night for the last time. It's past 7 o'clock, and my sisters will think I'm lost. I almost wonder they haven't sent the bellman after me." And thus they parted, without the kiss of betrothal, which Miss Luttrell would not consent to receive in the high road. But he had kissed her once in the lane, passionate lips pressed against unwilling lips, typical of that union which was to be no union, only self-interest and selfish, short-lived passion going hand in hand. "Oh dear," thought Elizabeth as she went in at the little garden gate, and knocked with the doll's house knocker on the doll's house door. "What a tiresome thing it is to be engaged." She had thought very differently 2 years ago, when her willing head rested for the first time on Malcolm Forde's breast, and a supreme contentment, which seemed more of heaven than of earth, descended on her soul. A perfect restfulness, like the serene stillness of a rescued vessel that lies at anchor in some sheltered harbour after long battling with wind and waves. "How he begins to worry me already," she thought of her new master. "I foresee that he will make me do whatever he likes, unless he goes too far and rouses the spirit of opposition in me. But Gertrude and Diana will not be able to crow over me any longer. That's one comfort. And I have done with small rooms and a small income. That is another." Her sisters had drunk tea, and dismissed the urn and teapot, and a cold and somewhat sloppy cup of their favourite beverage had been set aside for her on a little tray. She smiled involuntarily as she threw off her hat, and sat down in a corner to sip the cold tea, thinking how in a very short time pompous serving-men would hasten to administer to her wants, and her coming in and going out would be an affair of importance to a vast household. She sat in her corner, looking listlessly at her sisters grouped around the lamp, and engaged in their usual avocations, and could not help feeling that it was really very good of her to endure these small surroundings, even for the moment. "Where have you been all this time, Lizzie?" exclaimed Blanche, looking up from the construction of some futility in beadwork. "At the Melvins, I suppose, kettle drumming?" "Oh no, I went for a longer walk than usual, and forgot how late it was." "And have been roaming about alone after dark!" said Gertrude with a horrified look. "Oh, really, Elizabeth, if you must indulge your eccentric taste for solitary rambles, you might at least respect the opinion of the world so far as to gratify your strange taste within reasonable hours." "I have no respect for the opinion of the world. I have outraged it once, and perhaps may outrage it again." "Oh, which way did you go?" asked the pacific Blanche, anxious to change the subject. "Towards Ashcombe." "I wonder when Lord Paulyn is to be married," said Diana, contemplating some grand effect in a square inch of point lace. "Rather soon, I believe." "Where did you hear that? Oh, come now, you must have been calling somewhere, or you could not have heard the news." "I have not been calling anywhere, but I have reason to believe that Lord Paulyn is going to be married, and rather soon." "Oh, there's nothing new in that," said Diana. "The Dowager told us as much." "Would you like to be bridesmaids on the occasion, all of you?" asked Elizabeth. "What, bridesmaids to that horrid Miss Ramsay?" cried Blanche. "Oh no, not to Miss Ramsay, but to me." The youngest and most energetic of the Luttrells sprang from her seat, very nearly overturning the moderator lamp in her excitement. "To you? Oh, you darling, you have been cheating us all this time. And are you really going to be a great lady, and present us all at court, and give no end of balls and parties? Oh, it's too good to be true." "And as we had no ground for such an idea yesterday, when you were full of your continental wanderings, I really can't understand why we're to believe in such a thing to-night," observed Gertrude the pragmatical, with a spiteful look. "Oh, can't you? Oh, there are some people in whose lives great changes seem to happen by accident. The accident of a wicked anonymous letter helped to break off my engagement with Mr. Forde," with a keen glance at her eldest sister. "A chance meeting with Lord Paulyn this evening on the Roman bridge has altered my plans for going to Normandy. He made me an offer again to-night, for the third time in his life, and you accepted him," said Diana. "Oh, you must have been nearer idiocy than I should think a Luttrell could be, if you rejected him. But there is such a thing as constancy even to an idea," said Gertrude. "I should have thought Elizabeth would have cared more for the memory of Malcolm Forde than for worldly advantage." "No," answered Elizabeth defiantly, "I am not so slavish as to go on breaking my heart about a man for ever, and living screwed up in this box of a house has taught me the value of surroundings." "You will go to live at Ashcombe, I suppose," suggested Gertrude, "with the Dowager and Miss Disney. I can fancy how nice that will be for you." "I shall do nothing of the kind. I mean to live in the world, in the very centre of the great whirlpool, to go on spinning round perpetually in the fashionable maelstrom. A hazardous life for the welfare of an immortal soul," said Gertrude. "I have ceased to care for my soul since Malcolm gave me up. Indeed, I have a suspicion that my soul ceased to exist when he went away, leaving only some kind of mechanism in its place." End of Book 3, Chapter 3. Book 3, Chapter 4 of Strangers and Pilgrims, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 3, Chapter 4. Hoyden. This very morning my lord told me I should have 200 a year to buy pins. Now, nurse, if he gives me 200 a year to buy pins, what do you think he'll give me to buy fine petticoats? Nurse. Oh, my dearest, he deceives thee foully, and he's no better than a rogue for his pains. These Londoners have got a gibberish with 'em would confound a gypsy. That which they call pin money is to buy their wives everything in the varsal world, down to their very shoe ties. Unbounded was the rapture of Mrs. Chevenix when she received the unlooked-for tidings of Elizabeth's engagement. She wrote at once, urging that the wedding should take place in London. "Oh, it will be just the height of the season," she said, "and everybody in town. Gertrude, Di, and Blanche can come up with you. I will stretch a point and find rooms for all of you. You couldn't possibly be married from that footy little house in the Boroughbridge Road. And there will be your trousseau, you know, dear, a most serious question. For, of course, everything must be in the highest style. And I really doubt whether Cerise, whose real name, by the by, I have lately discovered to be Jones, is quite up to the mark for this occasion. She suits me very well, but I have lately discovered a want of originality in her style. So I think the better way would be to order your superior dinner and evening dresses from Paris, and give Cerise only the secondary ones. Believe me, my dear child, I shall not shrink from expense, but we will not fall into that foolish trick of ordering more dresses than you could wear in 6 months, ignoring the almost hourly changes of fashion. As Lord Paulin's wife, you will, of course, have unlimited means. By the way, as you have really no responsible male relative, the arrangement of settlements will devolve upon me. My lawyers, Messrs. Pringle and Scruprus, are well up in that kind of work, and will, I am sure, protect your interest as carefully as if you were the daughter of their oldest and most important client. This subject, thus mooted for the first time in Mrs. Chevenix's letter, was destined to cause a good deal of argument and unpleasantness between aunt and niece. "I will have no settlement," said Elizabeth resolutely. "I take nothing to him, except £60 or £70 a year, and he shall not be asked to settle ever so many hundreds upon me. I will not quite sell myself. Of course, he will give me fine dresses, and all I can want to make a brilliant figure in his own world. He has been patient enough and devoted enough for me to trust my interest to him. It stands to reason that I shall always have as much money as I can spend. He is overflowing with riches, and as his wife I shall have a right to my share of them. But I will not allow any one to ask him to name the price that he is willing to give for me. It shall not be quite a matter of buying and selling." "Very high-flown notions, and worthy of the most self-willed, unreasonable young woman that ever lived," exclaimed Mrs. Chevenix in a rage. "But I suppose you would hardly wish your children to starve. You will not object to their interests being provided for by people who know a little more about life than you do, self-opinionated as you may be." "My children," said Elizabeth, turning very pale. Could there be children, the very sanctification and justification of marriage, for her and for Reginald Paulyn, who in marriage sought only the gratification of their own selfish and sordid desires? My children? I can hardly fancy that I shall ever hear a voice call me mother. I seem so unfit to have little children loving me and trusting in me in their blind, childish way, she added dreamily, and then with a more practical air. "Oh, do what you please to protect their interest, auntie, in case Lord Paulyn should gamble away all his wealth on the racecourse. But remember, for me myself, not a penny." Nor was this an idle protest. She took care to give the family solicitors the same injunctions. And as Lord Paulyn was not a man to insist on extreme generosity in the preliminary arrangements of his marriage, he did not dispute her will. So certain estates were settled upon such younger sons as Elizabeth might hereafter bring to her husband, and certain smaller properties were charged with the maintenance of daughters. But the wife herself was left subject to the husband's liberality. Mrs. Chevenix shook her head ominously. "Was there ever anything so foolish? And after what we've seen of that old woman, too," she added, with somewhat disrespectful mention of her niece's future mother-in-law. Their knowledge of the dowager was certainly not calculated to inspire any exalted hope of the son's generosity. Yet in that foolish period which went before his marriage, Reginald Paulyn showed himself lavish in the gifts which he showered upon his mistress. Did she but frown, he propitiated her with an emerald bracelet. Was she angry with him without reason, she had her reward in a triplet of rings, red and white and green, like the Italian flag. The Paulyn diamonds, which had lain perdu since the dowager's last appearance at court, were dug out of the bank, and sent to be reset at a famous West End jeweller's. Elizabeth beheld their far-darting rays with dazzled eyes, and a mind that was almost bewildered by this fulfilment of all her childish dreams. It was like the story of Cinderella, nor does one know by any means that Cinderella cared very much about the prince. The old fairy tale is hardly a love story, but rather a romance of horses and carriages and other worldly splendour, and swift transition from a kitchen to a palace. After all, it was perhaps very lucky that Mr. Forde jilted me, Elizabeth thought, in her worldly-minded moments, when she was taken to look at the carriages which Lord Paulyn had chosen for her. The graceful shell-shaped barouche, the dainty brougham, with innumerable patent inventions for the comfort of its occupants. There had been no Paulyn town-house since the reign of George III., when Reginald's grandfather had inhabited a gaunt and dismal mansion out Manchester Square way, the freehold of which had been settled upon a younger son, and had in due course been forwarded to a money-lender. The dowager, in her day, had preferred living in furnished lodgings during her residences in the capital. So Elizabeth had the delight of choosing an abode at the West End, and finally, after exploring all the more fashionable quarters, selected a corner house in Park Lane, all balconies and verandahs, with a certain pleasing rusticity. "You must build me a huge conservatory on the top of that hideous pile of stabling and kitchens at the back," she said to her lover, to whom she issued her orders somewhat unceremoniously at this period of their lives, "and I must have a fernery or two somewhere." The selection of furniture for this balconied abode was an agreeable amusement for Miss Luttrell's mornings during the few weeks she spent in Eaton Place, and was not without its effect upon the balance that Lord Paulyn kept at his bank, which was an unusually small one for so wealthy a customer. The young lady showed a marvellous appreciation of the beautiful in art, and an aristocratic contempt for all questions of cost. She had her pet forms and colours, her caprices upon every subject, the gratification whereof was apt to be expensive. "She's like Lady Teazle, by Jove," grumbled the Viscount, opening his heart to a friend in the smoking-room of his favourite club, after a long morning at Calico's, the crack upholsterer. "Spends a fellow's money like water. By Jove, I feel sometimes inclined to growl, like the old buffer in the play." "Oh, sure to be so," said his friend, "if a fellow marries a poor man's daughter. They always make the money fly like old boots. Haven't been used to it, and like to see it spin. Just like a child that spins a sovereign on the table." "If she were to go on always like this, she'd be the ruin of me," murmured Reginald ruefully. "Oh, but of course it's only a spurt, and if she were inclined to do it by and by, I shouldn't let her." "Oh, of course not. You'll be able to put a stiffish curb when once she's in harness." This capacity for extravagance exhibited by his future wife gave Lord Paulyn subject for some serious thought. Even that refusal of a settlement, which at the first glance seemed so generous an impulse upon the part of Elizabeth, now assumed an alarming aspect. Might she not have refused any stated pin money simply because she intended to put no limit upon her expenditure? She meant to range at will over the whole extent of his pastures, not to be relegated to an allotted acreage, however liberal. She meant, in fact, to do her best to ruin him. "But that's a matter which will easily adjust itself after we're married," he said to himself, shaking off the sense of wild alarm which for some moments had possessed him. I won't have my income made ducks and drakes of, even to please the handsomest woman in Europe. A town house, once bought and furnished, is bought and furnished for our lifetime, and for our children and grandchildren after us. So a little extravagance in that line can't do much harm. And as to milliners and all that kind of thing, I shall let her know as soon as possible that if her bills go beyond a certain figure, she and I will quarrel. And so, with a little judicious management, I dare say I shall soon establish matters on a comfortable footing. So for these few weeks, her last of liberty, Lord Paulyn suffered his betrothed to have her own way, to have her fling, as he called it himself. Whatever her eyes desired as she roved at large in Calico's treasure chambers was instantly booked against her future lord. The rarest Sèvres, the most exquisitely carved ebony cabinets inlaid with plaques of choice old Wedgwood, easy chairs and sofas in which the designer's imagination had run riot, fairy-like coffee tables, inimitable what-nots, bedroom furniture in the ecclesiastical Gothic style, unpolished oak with antique brazen clamps and plates, furniture that might have been made for Mary Stuart, only that it was much handsomer than anything ever provided for that hapless lady's accommodation, as witness the rickety old oaken bedstead at Holyrood and King James's baby basket. Carpets from Elizabeth's own designs, where all the fairy ferns and wild flowers that flourish in Devonian woods bestrewed a ground of russet velvet pile. Of such mere sensuous pleasure, the rapture of choosing pretty things for her own possession, Elizabeth had enough in the days before her marriage. She was almost grateful to the man whose purse provided these delights. Perhaps if she could have quite put Malcolm Forde out of her thoughts, exiled his image from her mind for ever and ever, she might have been actually grateful, and even happy in the realization of her pet daydream. She had asked after her old friends of the Rancho when she first came to London, but found that hospitable mansion had disappeared, like Aladdin's palace when the Emperor of China looked out of the window and beheld only empty space where his parvenu son-in-law's residence had stood. The Cinq-Mars had been ruined somehow. No one, at any rate not any one in Mrs. Chevenix's circle, seemed to understand how. Mr. Cinq-Mars had been bankrupt, his name in the paper as journalist, stockbroker, theatrical manager, wine merchant, goodness knows what, and the Rancho estate had been sold by auction, the house pulled down, the umbrageous groves on the landward side ravaged by the axe, the ground cut up into shabby little roads of semi-detached villas leading to nowhere. The lawn and terrace by the river had been preserved, and were still in the market at a fabulous price. And what became of Mr. and Mrs. Cinq-Mars? Asked Elizabeth, sorry for people who had been kind to her, and surprised to find every one more interested in the fate of the domain than in its late tenants. Mrs. Chevenix shrugged her shoulders. Goodness knows. I have heard they went to America, or that they're living in a cheap quarter of Paris, Mr. Cinq-Mars speculating on the Bourse, that they're in Italy, Mrs. Cinq-Mars studying for the operatic stage. There are ever so many different stories afloat about them, but I have never troubled myself to consider which of the reports is most likely to be correct. You know, they were never friends of my own choosing. It was Lord Paulyn's whim that we should know them. Oh, but they were very kind and hospitable, auntie. Yes, they had their own views, no doubt, however. Their interest was not in Elizabeth Luttrell, but in the future Lady Paulyn. The best thing you can do, Lizzie, is to forget that you ever knew them. This was not a very difficult achievement for Elizabeth, whose thoughts rarely roamed beyond the focus of self, except in one solitary instance. Upon the details of Elizabeth's wedding it is needless to dwell. She was not married before the Derby Day, anxious as Lord Paulyn had been to anticipate that great British festival, but early in the flowery month of June, when the roses were just beginning to blow in the poor old vicarage garden, as Elizabeth thought with a sudden pang when she saw the exotics that decked her wedding breakfast. The marriage was, as other marriages, duly recorded in fashionable newspapers, and Mrs. Chevenix took care that etiquette should not be outraged by the neglect of the minutest detail, by so much as a quarter of an inch on the wrong side in the depth of the bride's bonnet and flounces, or a hackneyed dish among the entrees at the breakfast. So these two were made one, and went off together in the conventional carriage and four from Eaton Place to Paddington Station, en route for the Malvern Hills, where they were to moon away a fortnight as best they might, and then come back to town in time for Ascot races. And now, these chapters being purely retrospective, comes the autumn of the 5th year after Mr. Forde's farewell to Hawleigh. End of Book 3, Chapter 4. Book 3, Chapter 5 of Strangers and Pilgrims by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 3, Chapter 5. I strive to number all what day's remembrance can discover, which all that life or earth displays would lure me to live over. There rose no day, there rolled no hour of pleasure unembittered, and not a trapping decked my power that galled not while it glittered. They were at Slognadyac in Argyllshire, where at the foot of a heather-clothed mountain that ran up almost perpendicularly to meet the skies, Lord Paulyn had bought for himself a palatial abode in that Norman Gothic style which pervades the mansions of the north, a massive pile of buildings flanked by sugar-loaf towers, with one tall turret dominating the rest as a lookout for the lord of the castle when it was his fancy to sweep the waters with his falcon gaze. It is almost impossible to imagine a more delicious habitation, sheltered front and rear by those lofty hills, the blue waters of the Kyles of Bute lapping against its garden terrace, a climate equal to Torquay, long ranges of orchard houses where peaches and nectarines ripened as under Italian skies, orangeries, vineries, pineries, stabling of unlimited capacity, but chiefly devoted to such sturdy ponies as could best tread those rugged mountain roads. Verily, all that the soul of a Solomon himself, in the plenitude of his power and riches, could desire, in the golden autumn, when the grain was still ripening for the late northern harvest, making patches of vivid yellow here and there upon the gentler slopes at the base of the opposite hills, when the purple heather, like a Roman emperor's mantle, was spread over the mountain. The Norman castle was none of Lord Paulyn's building, not in those mediaeval fancies of keep and dungeon, not in those architectural caprices of machicolated battlements and elaborately carved mullions, did the heir of all the Paulyns squander that wealth which the dowager had accumulated by unheard-of scrapings and pinchings and self-denials during his long minority. The chateau of Slognadyac had been erected at the cost of a millionaire Glasgow manufacturer, who had made his money out of knife powder and scouring paper, and who, when he had built for himself this lordly dwelling-house, had the mortification of discovering that neither his wife nor children would consent to abide there. The heather-clad mountain, the blue water, the wide bosom of Loch Fyne stretching away in the distance, the wild denizens of that mountain region, the flutter of whose strong wings gladdened the heart of the sportsman, might be all very well, and to 3 or 4 weeks at Rothsay or Collintrave in the bathing season the lady and her daughters had no objection, but a fixed residence 6 months out of the 12 on that lonely shore they steadfastly refused to endure. So the scouring paper and knife powder manufacturer, to whom the cost of a Norman castle more or less was a mere bagatelle, gave his agent orders to dispose of the chateau at the earliest opportunity, and resigned himself to the sacrifice involved in such a sale. The house and its appurtenances had cost him 25,000, the land 5. He sold the whole to Lord Paulyn, after prolonged haggling, in which at last the Glasgow manufacturer showed himself unequal to the English nobleman, for 17,000, and went home after signing the contract to his mansion by the West Park, rejoiced to be rid of his useless toy. Lord Paulyn had been chiefly attracted to the place by its peculiar capacities for the abode of a yachting man. Slogh na Dyack stood on the edge of a bay, where there was anchorage for half a dozen yachts of the largest calibre, while on one side of the mansion there was a narrow inlet to a secondary harbour, a bay within a bay, a little basin hollowed out of the hills, where when tempests were raging the frailest bark might ride secure, so perfect was the shelter, so lofty the natural screen that fenced it from the winds. It was a harbour for fairies, a calm lakelet, in which on moonlit nights one would have scarcely been surprised to find Titania and her company sporting with the sylvan spray. Hither Reginald Paulyn brought his wife, after they had been married about 2 years and a half. It was her first visit, except for a flying glimpse of those mountain slopes from her husband's yacht, to Scotland, his land, her first lover's native land. The thought thrilled her even now, when the remembrance of the days in which he had loved her was like the memory of a dream. She had been married 2 years and a half, years in which she had drained the cup of worldly pleasure and of womanly sorrow also to the very lees. She had run riot in fashionable extravagances, given some of the most popular parties in London, in the house with the many balconies, won for herself the brilliant distinction that attends social success, queened it over all compeers by the insolence of her beauty, the dash and sparkle of her manner. For a little while, so long as the glamour lasted, and selfishness was subjugated by the intoxication of novelty, she had ruled her husband. Then had come disputes, in which she had been for the chief part triumphant. Then later disputes, in which his dogged strength of will had conquered, and then coldness, severance, estrangement, each tugging at the chain, eager to go his or her own way. But before the world, that world for which Elizabeth had chosen to live, Lord and Lady Paulyn appeared still a very happy young couple, a delightful example of that most delightful fact in natural history, a love match. Their quarrels at the worst, and they had been exceedingly bitter, had hardly been about the most serious things upon which men and women could disagree. Money matters, my lady's extravagance, had been the chief disturbing influence. The breast of neither husband nor wife had been troubled with the pangs of jealousy. Elizabeth's conduct as a matron was irreproachable. In the very vortex of fashionable frivolity, no transient breath of suspicion had ever tarnished the brightness of her name. The Viscount, in his unquestionable liberty, had ample room and verge enough for any sin against his marriage vow, were he inclined to be a sinner, but as yet Elizabeth had never stooped to suspect. Their estrangement, therefore, had not its root in those soul-consuming jealousies which sunder some unions. Their disputes were of a more sordid nature, the wranglings of two worldly-minded beings bent on their own selfish pleasures. 18 months after their marriage there came the one real affliction of Elizabeth's womanhood. A son had been born to her, fair as the first offspring of youth and beauty, a noble soul, or so it seemed to her, looking out of those clear childish eyes, a child who had the inspired seraphic look of the Holy Babe in a picture by Raphael, and whose budding nature gave promise of a glorious manhood. He was only a few months old, a few months which made up the one pure and perfect episode in Elizabeth's life, when he was taken away from her, not lost without bitterest struggles, vainest, fondest hopes, and deepest despair. For a little while after his death, the mother's life also hung in the balance. Reason tottered, darkness and horror shut out the light. Dragged through this tangle of mind and body, no one seeming to know very clearly which was out of joint, by physic which seemed to hinder, or nature which finally healed, the bereaved mother went back to the world, and tried to strangle grief in the endless coil of pleasure, worked harder than a horse at a mill, and smiled sometimes with a heart that ached to agony, had brief flashes of excitement that seemed like happiness, defied memory, tried to extinguish regret for the tender being she had loved in a more exclusive devotion to self, grew day by day harder and more worldly, lost even the power to compassionate the distress of others, saying to herself in a rebellious spirit, "Is there any sorrow like unto my sorrow?" To Lord Paulyn the loss of his firstborn had been a blow, but not an exceedingly heavy one. He had considered the baby a fine little fellow, had caressed him and tossed him in the air occasionally, at somewhat remote intervals, after the approved fashion of fathers, while smirking nurses marvelled at his lordship's condescension, but he was not broken down by the loss of him. He was a young man, and not in a desperate hurry for an heir. He had something of that feeling which monarchs have been said to entertain upon the subject of their eldest sons, an inclination to regard the heir apparent as a memento mori. "By Jove, it isn't the liveliest thing to look forward to," he had said to his friends when arguing upon the subject in the abstract. "A young fellow who'll go and dip himself up to the hilt with a pack of money-lenders, and borrow on post-obits, and play old gooseberry with his father's estate by the time he's 21, and perhaps make a finish by marrying a ballet girl before he's 22. It was after a season of surpassing brilliancy, an unbroken round of gaieties, involving the expenditure of so much money that Lord Paulyn groaned and gnashed his teeth when the butler brought in the midsummer bills, a season which had ended in the most serious quarrel Elizabeth and her husband had ever had, that the Viscount brought his wife to this Norman chateau, not in love, but in anger, intending this banishment to the coast of Argyll as a means of bringing the lady to a due sense of her iniquities and a meek submission to his will. "She'll find it rather difficult to get rid of money there," he said to himself with a sardonic grin, "and I shall take care to fill the house with visitors of my choosing. There'll be Hilda, too, to look after my interest. Yes, I think I shall have the upper hand at Slogh na Dyack." This was another change which the last year had brought to pass. Just at the end of the London season, happening so opportunely after the last ball at Buckingham Palace, as Madame Passementerie, the French milliner, ventured to remark to Lady Paulyn's maid Gimp, the noble house of Paulyn had been thrown into mourning by the demise of the dowager. The noble lady had led a life of extreme seclusion throughout a prolonged widowhood, said the obituary notice in a fashionable journal, thus offering the most touching tribute which affection can pay to those it has cherished while on earth, and still fondly mourns when transferred to a higher sphere. Honoured and beloved alike by equals and dependents, she was the centre and source of all good to those who came within her peaceful circle, and she was followed to her last resting place in the family vault at old Ashcombe Church by a train of friends, tenants, and retainers, in which long procession of mourners there was not one who did not lament the loss of a valued friend or an honoured benefactress. The notice had been written for another patrician widow, but served very well for Lady Paulyn, about whom the editors of newspapers knew little or nothing. She had lived a retired life in the depths of the country, and it was argued that she must of necessity have been benevolent and beloved. Her death, at the age of 74, had been occasioned by an accident. Sitting up one night in her dressing-room after the household had retired, poring over her agent's last accounts, she had set fire to her cap, an elaborate construction of blonde and ribbons, and had been a good deal burnt about the head and face before Hilda, who slept in an adjacent room, and was promptly awakened by her screams, could rush to her rescue. Her constitution, vigorous to the last, held out for a little while against grim death, but the shock proved too much for the aged frame, whose sap and muscle had been wasted by the asceticism of economy. The dowager died a few hours after telegrams and express trains had brought her son to her bedside. As she had only consented to be just barely civil to Elizabeth in their unfrequent intercourse, it was not to be supposed that her departure from this world could be a profound affliction to the reigning Viscountess. She was sorry that her mother-in-law's death should have been a painful one, and perhaps that was all. "What a pity that old people can't die like that person in Mrs. Thrale's 3 Warnings," she said afterwards. "Death ought to come quietly to fetch them, without any unnecessary suffering, only a natural surprise and annoyance at being taken away against one's will, like a child that's fetched home from a nursery ball. The Viscount contemplated his bereavement chiefly from a business-like point of view. "I'm afraid the Devonshire estates will go to pot now my poor mother's gone," he said dolefully. "I shall never get any one to screw the tenants as she did. That agent fellow Lawson was only a cipher. It was the old woman who really did the work and kept them up to collar. I shall feel the difference now she's gone, poor old soul." "I suppose Miss Disney will go into lodgings at Torquay or somewhere, and live upon her private means," said Elizabeth, hardly looking up from the pages of a new novel she was skimming, seated luxuriously in one of the Park Lane balconies, in a very bower of summer blossoms, kept in perennial bloom by the minions of the nurseryman. This sounded as if she had forgotten a certain conversation in a Devonshire lane one dusky March evening. "I thought I told you Hilda has no means," answered the Viscount rather gloomily. "She must come to live with us, of course." "What, in our house, where we live? Won't that be rather like that strange person who lives over somewhere beyond the Rocky Mountains, and has ever so many wives? I'm sure if Miss Disney is to live with us, I shall feel myself a number two." "I wish you wouldn't talk such confounded nonsense, Elizabeth. I suppose you'll pick up that sort of thing from your friends, who all seem to talk the same jargon, turning up their noses at everybody in creation." "Oh, no, but seriously, can't Miss Disney go on living at Ashcombe? I should think she ought to be able to screw the tenants. She must have learnt your poor mother's ways." "Miss Disney will have a home in my house wherever it is, and I think you ought to be uncommonly glad to get hold of a sensible young woman for a companion. As to my keeping up a separate establishment at Ashcombe for one person's accommodation, that's too preposterous an idea to be entertained for a moment. I shall try and let the place as it stands. You'll be thankful enough for her society, I dare say, at Slogh na Dyack." "I shall have the hills and the sea," said Elizabeth. "They'll be better company for me than Miss Disney." She had seen the chateau in the course of a yachting expedition in the autumn of last year, when the Viscount, sorely alarmed by the nature of the illness that had followed the loss of her boy, had taken her to roam the blue waters in quest of health and spirits. Health and spirits had come in some measure, health that was fitful, spirits that were apt to be forced and spurious, a laugh that had a false ring in it, mirth which sounded sweet enough at one time, but jangled out of tune and harsh at another. So the Viscount wrote to inform Hilda Disney that henceforth her life was to be spent in his household, wrote as briefly and unceremoniously as he might have written to a housemaid, and a week later Miss Disney came to Park Lane, covered with crape, pale, placid, impenetrable. Elizabeth made a great effort over herself in order to receive this newcomer with some faint show of kindness. "I hope you two mean to get on well together," said the Viscount, in a little speech that sounded like a command. "I have no doubt we shall get on remarkably well, if we don't interfere with each other," answered Elizabeth. "I believe that is the secret of a harmonious household." This was an intimation designed to give Miss Disney a correct idea of her position, a hint which that young lady fully comprehended. She accepted this position with a certain quiet grace, which might have won the heart of any one who had a heart to be won. Elizabeth's had been given away twice over, once to Malcolm Forde, once to her lost baby. Her small stock of love had been spent on these two. There was no room in her cold, weary heart for anything but the ashes of that old fire. Certainly no admission for Hilda Disney. But as at this stage of affairs that young person appeared content to be a cipher in her new home, Elizabeth's languid indifference was not kindled into active dislike. She tolerated the intruder, but at the same time avoided her. This was the position of affairs when Lord Paulyn and a few chosen friends began life and grouse shooting on the moors around Slogh na Dyack. To Elizabeth's jaded spirits, worn out by the small excitements of society, The change was at first a welcome one. It was pleasant to find herself mistress of a new domain, which differed widely from her other dominions; very pleasant to be remote from the region of race-horses and trainers, and trial gallops, and experimental exercise of rival 2-year-olds in the dewy dawn of autumnal mornings, trials in which, out of mere politeness, she had been obliged sometimes to affect an interest. The novelty of the Norman castle and its surroundings delighted her, nor was she discouraged by its seclusion, or particularly afflicted by the usurpation of the limited number of spare bedrooms by her husband's sporting cronies, whereby she was deprived of the society of half a dozen or so of her own dearest friends, whose reception she had planned as one of the amusements of her Scottish home. The architect whose mediaeval mind had designed Slogh na Dyack had refused to fritter away his space upon spare bedrooms, reserving his resources for sugar-loaf turrets, dungeons, keeps, Gothic balconies, perforated battlements, picture galleries, a banqueting hall with a groined roof and a musician's gallery, a tennis court, and a cloistered walk under the drawing-room floor. "You will have to build me a new wing next year, Reginald," Lady Paulyn observed, after expressing her general approval of the chateau. "It is all very well for us to exist in this benighted manner, for I don't count your shooting people as visitors, for once in a way, but we couldn't possibly exist here another year without a dozen or so more rooms." "Couldn't we?" said the Viscount, putting on his sullen air, which meant war to the knife. "I chose Slogh na Dyack just because it was a little out of the beaten track. Not much, though, for people go to Oban nowadays just as they used to go to Brighton, and because it has precious little accommodation for your cackling brood of dear friends. No stowage for French waiting-maids and such rubbish. A place where I could feel myself master, and where I might expect you would even take the trouble to devote a little time to my society." Elizabeth yawned. "To hear you talk about shooting innocent birds, and of what your horses are going to do next year, and what they ought to have done but did not do this year. What a pity there should be such a sameness in domestic conversation." "I suppose you'd like it better if I could talk about converting the heathen," snarled the Viscount. It was not the first time he had tried to sting his wife with an allusion to the lover who had jilted her. "I should like it better if you had a mind wide enough to be interested in human beings instead of in dogs and horses," she answered, flashing out at him passionately. Miss Disney was a mute witness of this little scene, but a mere cipher, whose presence had no restraining influence. "I shall not think of coming here next year unless there are some more rooms built," Elizabeth remarked decisively, after a little more skirmishing. "We needn't talk about coming next year until we've quite made up our minds to go away. This place has a famous winter climate," said the Viscount, looking into a huge sealskin case, as if in search of some rare species of cigar, the selection whereof was a work of time. He had a knack of looking down when he said disagreeable things. "I could not endure the place for more than 2 months," replied his wife, "and I've made engagements for December." "Well, that's a pity, for I've invited some fellows here for Christmas." "Well, I'm sure you're at liberty to entertain them, with Miss Disney's assistance. I shall resign all my privileges as chatelaine at the end of November." "Well, we'll see about that," said Lord Paulyn darkly. But as he had often uttered this mystic threat, and nothing had ever come of it, except that Elizabeth always had her own way, in spite of him, the lady was not appalled by his dark speech. It is not to be supposed that Lady Paulyn was always uncivil to her husband, that she flouted him in season and out of season. She had her intervals of sunshine and sweetness, smiled upon him as she did upon society, and with almost as empty a smile, bewitched him even with something of the old witchery, for despite his numerous aggravations he still admired her, and still fondly believed her the handsomest woman in Europe. This was the state of affairs when Hilda Disney first entered their household, But their domestic life underwent a gradual change after her coming. It was as if, by some subtle influence, she widened the gulf between them, without design, without malice, but only by her presence. If she had been a statue, she could scarcely have seemed more innocent of evil intention, more unconscious of the harm she did, and yet she parted them irrevocably. She offended the wife by no demonstrative affection for the husband, yet by an unobtrusive concern for his comfort, a perpetual solicitude, an unsleeping care of his well-being, shown in the veriest trifles, but shown almost hourly. She made the wife's indifference 1,000 times more obvious than it had ever been before. By her interest in his conversation, by her appreciation of his vapid jokes, her acute perception of the smallest matters in which his prosperity or success was involved, she reminded him of his wife's utter apathy about all these things. One of the grievances of his married life was the fact that he had never been able to interest Elizabeth in the details of his racing stud, those narrow chances and hairbreadth failures which make or mar the fortunes of the year. She liked Epsom and Ascot and Newmarket and Goodwood and Doncaster and York well enough as scenes of gaiety and excitement, festivals in which her beauty made her a kind of queen. She could even admire a winning horse as a grand and famous creature, but she had not a mathematical brain, and could not by any means comprehend that intricate process of calculation by which great results are sometimes arrived at in the racing world, and by which the Napoleons of the turf accumulate their colossal fortunes. In this she was the very reverse of Hilda, whose arithmetical powers had been trained to extreme acuteness in the service of the late dowager, and who, without any natural fondness for horses, could enter into all the complications of a betting book, could even on some rare occasion give a wrinkle to the Viscount himself, as that gentleman remarked with supreme astonishment. "Upon my word, you know, Hilda, you're the downiest bird, I beg your pardon, the cleverest woman I have ever met with. If my wife had only your brains—" "With her own beauty? That would be too much. Not that my brains are anything to boast of, but I have been trained in a rather severe school." "I should think you have indeed. My mother was an out-and-outer. I don't believe there ever was such a screw, you know, before her time, or ever will be after it. There ought to be something of the kind put up in Ashcombe Church, by Jove. It would look well in Latin, that quotation of Burke's, for instance. Magnum vectigul est parsimoniae. But you have got a wider way of looking at this than my mother. And as for looks, if you're not as handsome as Elizabeth, who really is the finest woman in Europe, you've no reason to complain of your share of good looks. And you know there was a day when I used to say a good deal more than that." A faint colour came into Hilda's fair face. "We were children then," she said. "Oh, hang it, I was at Oxford in the University 8. There wasn't much of the child about me, Hilda." "Except in a childish want of judgment, not knowing your own mind, in short," she answered, looking down at a flimsy printed catalogue of race-horses which they had been studying together when this conversation began. "Oh, well, we settled all that long ago. Let bygones be bygones, Hilda." "Was it I who recalled the past?" "Well, I'm sure it wasn't I," answered Lord Paulyn hastily, "and I don't want to recall it. I don't forget what a temper you had in those days, Hilda. Children, indeed! You were a child who knew how to call a fellow over the coals like anything. I've a very keen recollection of some of our shindies. That was all so long ago, and I'm an old married man now. So I thought we should be able to get along very well together. And I must say you're wonderfully improved. 10 years more grinding in my mother's mill has made a difference, hasn't it?" "I hope I've conquered my evil tempers and everything else that was foolish in me." said Hilda meekly. That little demure speech of Miss Disney's set the Viscount thinking. 10 years ago there had been certain love passages between himself and his cousin, a pretty little pastoral flirtation, which filled the intervals of his field sports pleasantly enough, but which, begun for the amusement of long dull autumnal afternoons in a dreary old house, ended somewhat seriously. The girl had been serious from the beginning. Her cousin, Reginald, was the only man whose society had ever brightened the dismalities of her joyless home. He was young, good-looking, energetic, and possessed that superfluity of physical strength which gives a kind of dash and swagger to a man's manner of doing things, a dash and swagger that in the eyes of inexperienced girlhood pass for courage and chivalry. He rode well, shot superbly, talked the latest Oxonian slang, the novelty of which language was agreeable after the dowager's dull grumblings and perpetual prosing upon small worries. In a word, he was the only thing that Hilda Disney had to love, and she loved him, hiding more intensity than he could have suspected under her placid demeanour. For a short time, a long vacation and a Christmas visit, he reciprocated her passion. The fair, still face seemed to him the perfection of patrician beauty, a wonderful relief after certain sirens of the barmaid order, with whose lighter converse he was wont to soften the asperities of classic learning. He had vague thoughts of a future in which Hilda should be his wife, and was severely rated by his widowed parent upon the folly of his course. Marry Hilda, indeed, without a sixpence or a rag to her back that was not supplied by charity. He had better pick up a beggar girl in the street at once, and then his next of kin would at least have the satisfaction of taking out a statute of lunacy on his behalf. But the passion passed, as passions were apt to pass with the Viscount. A barmaid flirtation, more in earnest than previous barmaid flirtations, blotted out the milder charms of his cousin. When he came to Ashcombe in the next long vacation, he thought her looking pale and faded, nor was her temper improved. She perceived his indifference and taxed him with it, and then came bitter little speeches, sudden bursts of tears, angry rushes from the room, banging of doors, and all the varieties of squabbling that compose lovers' quarrels, until at last, with a praiseworthy candour, the Viscount confessed that he had for some time past ceased to care for his cousin, except in the most cousinly way. "If you're ever in want of a friend, you know, Hilda, you can come to me. And wherever I live by and by, when my mother goes off the hooks, my house will be your home, if you haven't got one of your own." She acknowledged this offer with some dignity, but with a very white face and lips that quivered faintly in spite of her firmness, and expressed the hope that she might never intrude upon his hospitality. Well, I hope you'll make a good match, Hilda," he said, rather awkwardly. "And then, of course, you'll be independent of me and mine. But I shall never forget you, and how fond I was of you, and all that. Oh, by the way, you may as well give me back the letters I wrote you from Oxford. One never knows when that sort of rubbish may fall into dangerous hands, and make no end of mischief. Hunt 'em all up, will you, Hilda? And we'll amuse ourselves with a bonfire this wet morning." Hilda informed him, after a few moments' hesitation, that she had made the bonfire already. "I burnt them one by one as they came, after I had read them once or twice," she said. "It was safer on account of my aunt, the surest way of preventing them from falling into dangerous hands." "What a deep card you are! As deep as Garrick, upon my word. You're quite sure you burnt them?" "Oh, quite sure. Don't be alarmed, Reginald. There'll be no action for breach of promise." "Oh, it isn't that, you know. No girl with a ha'porth of self-respect would go in for that sort of thing, much less such a girl as you. Only old letters are the deuce and all for creating trouble in a man's life. I'm glad you burnt them." Never since these juvenile love passages, which left a somewhat unpleasant flavour in Lord Paulyn's mouth, a flavour of remorse perhaps, had he liked Hilda so well as he liked her now, in their quiet life at Slogh na Dyack. She was of so much use to him, so able a counsellor, so ready a confidante. He gave her a pile of his house steward's bills to look over, and she charmed him at once by suggesting that he should in future pay ready money for all household supplies, or make weekly payments to be ranked as ready money, and claim a discount of 10% on all such accounts. "No doubt the tradesmen pay your people 5% already," she said. "They would willingly pay you 10 for the sake of getting ready money. Your discounts ought to pay the wages of half your household, instead of going into the servants' pockets." By such brilliant flashes of genius did Hilda charm her cousin. He groaned aloud as he compared this skilled economist with his wife, whose extravagances still rankled in his mind, and whose refusal of a settled allowance he had not ceased to consider an artful stroke of business, whereby she had reserved to herself the right of unlimited expenditure. "If ever I let her leave Slogh na Dyack, I shall restrict her to an allowance of 500 a year," he said to himself. But there were times when the spirit of anger against his wife burnt so fiercely within him that he had serious thoughts of making her spend the rest of her life in Argyllshire, with only such changes of scene as his yacht might afford her, a cruise in the Mediterranean now and then, or a run to Madeira or St. Michael's. "It'll suit me well enough for 6 months of the year. I can always run up from Glasgow when there are any races on," reflected Lord Paulyn, who, after the manner of racing men, thought nothing of spending his night in railway carriages, speeding at express rate over the face of the country. Elizabeth perceived the harmony that reigned between her husband and his cousin, perceived that he no longer troubled himself with the futile endeavour to impart his perplexities to her non-mathematical brain. She saw all this, and without being absolutely jealous — was jealousy possible where love was absent? — was keenly stung by this preference. She had been accustomed to think of her husband as her slave, a refractory slave sometimes, but never able to put off his bondage, a creature to be made glad by her smile, to be subdued into submission by her frown. She had felt the sense of her power over him all the more keenly because in the society of other women he was for the most part morose or indifferent, wrapped up in his own thoughts about his own amusements or speculations, slow to comply with the exigencies of polite life, a man who, if he had not been the rich Lord Paulyn, might have been called a bore. To her own chosen friends he had been habitually uncivil. Beauty, except her own, seemed to have no charm for him. Wit and vivacity only bored him. All the graces of feminine costume were a dead letter. "I think you wore cherry colour with blue sleeves," he answered once, when his wife questioned him upon a fashionable toilette. "Or was it Lord Zetland's colours, white and red? Upon my soul, I don't know which." She beheld him now for the first time interested in the society of another woman, and beheld with wonder that woman's capacity for understanding him and sympathising with him. Mortified by this discovery, she avenged herself at first by reducing the Viscount's sporting friends to a state of abject slavery, but speedily wearying of this shallow amusement, grew sullen, shut herself up in her own rooms, the best in the house, occupying the whole front of the second story, and sweeping the waters of the Strait and the purple hills on the opposite side, read, sketched, and brooded, or roamed alone on the mountain side, and thought of her dead and gone youth, and the lover she had loved and lost. His image haunted her in this lonely region, in this tranquil, empty life, more than it had ever haunted her since she had knelt down upon her bridal eve and prayed to God for strength to forget him. She was in his native country for the first time in her life, and that she should think of him seemed only a natural association of ideas. Nor was this all. She felt herself injured by her husband's evident liking for his cousin's society, and so opened the doors of her heart to fatal memories. Lived again as in a dream her brief summer-tide of joy and sorrow, gave up her thoughts to sad musings upon that foolish past. Sometimes she varied the burden of that sorrow by thinking of her dead baby. Alas, how often in her dreams had she felt those little arms clasped about her neck, those sweet soft breathings on her cheek, and red lips like opening flowers pressed warm against her own. She thought of what that romantic home might have been to her, still blessed with her boy, fancied the sunny noontide on the grassy slope above the blue water, or the terrace sheltered from northern winds by a grove of pinasters, or in the flower garden behind the house, a fertile hollow at the foot of the mountain, wandering on the mountain top with her darling in her arms, the summer air noisy with loud humming of bees, and the sweet west wind blowing around them. Not for her these tender pleasures, only loneliness and regret, the bitter memory of things that had once been sweet. Pride stifled all expression of anger at her husband's defection. Not by word or look did she betray her displeasure at the position which Hilda Disney was fast assuming in the household. On the contrary, she suffered the reins to slip from her hands as if weary of the burden of government. Her old languor and dislike of exertion, except in pursuit of some novel pleasure, returned to her. Life at Slogh na Dyack was very much like life at Hawleigh Vicarage. There was only a difference of detail. Trained serving men in place of a parlour-maid, a certain state and splendour in all the machinery of the household. The evenings in the long drawing-room, with its mediaeval oak furniture, modern French tapestries, and Brummagem armoury, all made on purpose for the chateau at the cost of the Glasgow knife-powder maker, were just as dull as the evenings in the old days, when she had yawned over a novel in the society of her three sisters. Lord Paulyn and his guests congregated in the smoking-room, or paced the wide stone hall, a spacious vaulted chamber, always odorous with tobacco, or strolled on the terrace, staring at the moonlit water and talking of their day's work among the birds. They were men who walked 30 miles or so between breakfast and dinner, and who, after devoting a couple of hours to their evening gorge, retired within themselves like boa constrictors, and were in no manner dependent upon feminine society. So, when Elizabeth, weary of their vapid compliments, and despising the petty triumph afforded by the subjugation of such small deer, ceased to be particularly civil to them, they deserted the drawing-room almost entirely, and solaced themselves with smoke and billiards or placid slumbers, stretched at ease upon morocco-covered divans, lulled by the ripple of the wavelets that lapped against the beach. Once in 10 days or so Lord Paulyn sped southward for a day's racing, generally accompanied by a chosen friend, and returned, depressed or elated as the case might be, to talk over all his proceedings, his triumphs or his failures, with his cousin Hilda. These confabulations, which took place openly enough in some snug corner of the drawing-room, wounded Elizabeth to the quick. She began to think that all those vapid men saw the slight thus put upon her, and discussed it in their smoking-room conclaves. She began to fancy that her very servants were losing some touch of their old reverence, that her maid had a compassionate air. "Shall I live to be pitied?" she asked herself, remembering that she had sold herself to the bondage of a loveless marriage for the sake of being envied. One day she determined upon sending for Blanche, in order to bring some new force to bear upon Miss Disney, but upon the next day altered her mind. She would not endure that her sister, even her best-loved, most trusted sister, should see that there was an influence in her husband's house stronger than her own. "Blanche would go on so," she said to herself, "and I feel too weak and tired to bear fuss of any kind. And after all, what does it matter if my husband's found somebody to be interested in his racing talk? It never interested me, only I believe that Hilda's sympathy is all put on. No woman could be interested in handicapping and Chester cups for ever and ever." So Lady Paulyn made no struggle to maintain her authority. She allowed Hilda to drive her pony carriage and make friends with the few families scattered in pretty white villas here and there upon the coast. She left to Hilda the trouble of dispensing tea and coffee at the 8 o'clock breakfast. The gentlemen were early at Slogh na Dyack, and over the hills and far away before 10. She suffered Hilda to receive the sportsmen when they came straggling up from the boat, with the dogs at their heels, and she rarely appeared herself in the public rooms of the chateau till a quarter of an hour before the 8 o'clock dinner. She had the long days to herself, and roamed alone where she would, making her companions of the hills and the blue sea. Sometimes, when she looked from the hill-tops towards the Mull of Kintyre, her soul yearned to escape by that rock-bound point, to sail away to the South Sea Isles, and toil for God's sake by the side of the man she loved. Oh, how easy, how sweet, how smooth it seemed to her now, that better life which she had cast away. Oh, how easy it would have been for me to do good for his sake, she said, to be schooled by him, to become anything that he could make me, a saint almost by his pure influence. And then from that distant seaward opening, from that dream-like gaze toward an unknown world far away, her tired eyes would sink downward to the towers and pinnacles of Slogh na Dyack, like a fairy palace dimly seen through the misty atmosphere. Was it not verily the fairy palace of her dreams, symbol of the Cinderella's triumph she had fancied for herself in her childish visions? I wonder whether Cinderella was happy, she said to herself, or if she ever wished herself back among the cinders, and hated her fairy godmother for having made her a princess. She found rich husbands for her sisters at any rate, and that's more than I've done. I have been no use in the world to any one but myself. On quiet Sundays, and the Sabbath at Slogh na Dyack was very quiet, the sound of bells ringing through the soft summer air brought back the thought of Hawleigh and the grave old church, its massive clustered columns and lofty arches, shadowy aisles sonorous with the fresh young voices of the choir, and sometimes with his voice alone, reading the lessons of the day with a tender earnestness that gave familiar words a new meaning. Here in the little Episcopalian chapel the sacred rites were sorely stinted. No white-robed choristers trooping in through the vestry door, no decorated altar-cloths or floral festivals, but the same dull round from year's end to year's end, a harmonium grumbling an accompaniment of common chords to the dullest selection of hymns extant, and one elderly incumbent prosing his feeble little sermons and doing his best to maintain the dignity of his church single-handed. Elizabeth and Miss Disney were regular in their attendance at this small temple, which was an unpretentious edifice of corrugated iron, like a gigantic Dutch oven, until at last, after about half a dozen Sundays, Lady Paulyn wearied of the elderly incumbent. "There's another Episcopalian chapel at Dunallin," she said, "a real stone, pretty little Gothic building, which can hardly be so intolerably hot as this oven. I shall take the pony carriage this afternoon and go over there." She did not invite Miss Disney to join her in this expedition, so that young lady, who made a point of holding herself aloof from all intercourse to which she was not specially invited, and who had certainly received no inducement to abandon this reserve, went her own ways to the little iron church in the island, while Lady Paulyn drove to Dunallen. It was a calm, sunless afternoon, with an atmosphere that seemed made on purpose for Sundays, a day on which the birds forget to sing and the rabbits lie asleep in their holes. The Kyles of Bute looked smooth as an Italian lake, but there was no Italian sky above them, only the uniform grey of Scottish heavens, unbroken save for the white mist wreaths on the hill-tops. The Viscount and his friends, after having spent all the lawful days of the week in perambulating the moors, lunching on the mountain-top upon savoury stews cooked in a travelling kitchener, washed down with Glenlivat, were not sorry for the day of rest, which they devoted to lying full length on the divans in the smoking-room, or sauntering in the garden and hothouses, talking Newmarket and Tattersall's. Going to church was not among their accomplishments. Dunallen was a hamlet among the hills, round which sundry white stone villas had scattered themselves, a hamlet on a winding hillside road, looking downward across an undulating tract of fertile meadow and cornfield to the blue bosom of the loch. Lady Paulyn had marked the spot, and the little Gothic Episcopalian church, lately erected at the cost of a landowner in the neighbourhood, in the course of her lonely rambles. The village was within 3 miles of Slochnidyack, and one of her favourite walks was in the moorland above it. The bells were ringing with a sweet solemn sound in the still air as the little carriage drove round the curve of the hill and up to the pretty Gothic doorway of Dunallen Chapel. The Presbyterian church stood a few paces off, a gaunt edifice of 50 years ago, grim and uncompromising, as who should say, "Here you will only get plain substantial fare, and no foreign kickshaws, something to bite at in the way of theology." Behind the Episcopalian chapel, with its dainty dandified air, there rose a little grove of firs upon the green slope of the hill, crowning the Gothic pinnacles with their dark verdure, and in front of the fir grove, a few yards from the chapel, stood a tiny manse, a miniature Tudor villa, in which a young newly wedded incumbent might have found life very picturesque and pleasant, but in which there would hardly have been breathing room for a pastor with a large family. Lady Paulyn was one of the first to enter the small church, and was speedily conducted to a comfortable seat by an obsequious pew-opener who had marked the arrival of the carriage. The light within was softened by painted windows from Munich, the open seats were of dark oak, the small temple had the look of a labour of love. The service was conducted in the usual unornamental style. A little stout man with sandy whiskers read prayers at a hand gallop to a sparse congregation, who afterwards joined their vinegar voices in a shrill hymn, not one of those hymns ancient and modern which Elizabeth loved so well, but a dry as dust composition, which would never have given wings to any heavenward soaring soul. Elizabeth thought these ministrations but a small improvement on the services of the corrugated iron chapel at Slochnidyack. She had fallen into a drowsy, absent-minded condition by the time the shrill singing was finished, and did not take the trouble to look up to see the little stout man trot up the pulpit stairs. She sat looking down at the loosely clasped hands in her lap, when another voice, without any preliminary prayer, gave out the text. And lifting her eyes with a wild stare, in which rapture and surprise were strangely blended, she saw a tall figure in a surplice in the place where the little man might have stood, the figure of Malcolm Forde. No cry broke from her lips, though her heart beat as it had never beaten before. She sat dumbly looking at him, white as death, with fixed, dilated eyes. The dead newly risen from the grave could not have moved her more deeply. Oh, great heavens, how she loved him! It seemed to her as if in that moment only she realized the overwhelming force of her love. A new world, a new life were contained in his presence. To see him there, only to see and hear him, whatsoever gulf yawned between them, was new life to her, renovated youth, hope, joy, enthusiasm, aspiration for higher things. Oh God, if I can only hear his voice every Sunday, she thought, I will worship him and live for him, and be good and pure for his sake, and never strive to lessen the distance that divides us. What more joy can I desire than to know that he lives, and is well and happy, and breathes the same air that I breathe, and looks out across the same sea, and is near me unawares. Oh, thank God for the chance that brought me to Slochnidyack. Thank God for my bonny Scottish home. His sermon to-day was like his old sermons, full of life and fire and quiet force and supreme tenderness, the sermon of a man speaking to a cherished flock out of a heart overflowing with love. And yet she fancied that his tones had lost something in mere physical power. That deep-toned voice was weaker than of old. Once he stopped, exhausted, at the close of a sentence, with an appearance of fatigue that she had never seen in him at Hawleigh, and his face looked very pale in the cold light from a northern window. The thought of this change touched her heart with a sudden sense of fear. That spiritual countenance turned to the northern light, those deep hollow eyes, all the lines of the face more sharply chiselled than of old, something that was not age, but rather an indication of hard wear and tear that stood in the place of age. These were the tokens of his late labours, the seal that his mission had set upon him. "Oh, if he should die," she said to herself, appalled, "while I, who seem made of some hard common clay, too tough to be broken by sorrow, go on living." The sermon was not a long one. There was no hymn afterwards, only the clink-clink of shillings and sixpences into the bowl, which a grim-looking Scotchman carried round the little church. The service altogether had been of the briefest, and Donald, the groom, who perhaps took his measure from a familiarity with the Presbyterian office, had not arrived with the pony carriage when Lady Paulyn came out of the church. She looked around her with something like terror at finding herself standing almost alone by the church door, knowing that Malcolm Forde was so near, might come through that open door at any moment and meet her face to face, for the first time since he had cast her from his heart with cruel, deliberate repudiation. She thought of the morning on which she had gone to his lodgings in quest of him, gone with a determination to humble herself, to ask for his forgiveness and his blessing before he left her for ever. And behold, that bitter parting, that loss of something which had seemed to her the very life of her life, had not been for ever. The world which seemed so wide was narrow enough to bring these two face to face again. "Oh, if I had seen him that morning, and he had forgiven me, I should never have married Lord Paulyn," she said to herself. "If he had left me only a few words of kindness or forgiveness, I would have been true to his memory all my life. But his coldness drove me mad. I had no memory of the past to console me. I had no hope in the future to sustain me." Still no sign of Donald and the ponies. The scanty congregation had dispersed, and the mountain road was empty. She stood watching the curve round which the ponies must in due time appear, half dreading, half hoping that Malcolm Forde might come that way. She had been waiting about 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour, a period which seemed almost interminable, when she heard the shutting of a distant door and the sound of footsteps approaching her. She had gone a little way along the road in the opposite direction to the vicarage. The incumbent and his friend would be likely to return thither when the service was ended. She had not flung herself purposely in the path of her old lover. She heard the footsteps drawing nearer, and the voices of two men conversing. One, the thin, reedy pipe of the incumbent; the other, that deep, graver organ whose every tone she knew so well. They had gone a little way past her when the short, stout gentleman, who had been apprised by the appearance of a stray sovereign in the alms basin that some important member of his flock, or perchance some illustrious stranger, had been among the congregation, turned himself about to behold her, pirouetting in an airy manner, as if admiring the beauties of the landscape. "Lady Paulyn, I declare," he murmured to his companion, after a brief survey. His companion stared at him for a moment with a look of sheer amazement, and stopped short. "What Lady Paulyn? Do you mean an old woman, Lord Paulyn's mother?" "Oh no, a young woman, and a very handsome one. The Dowager Lady Paulyn died a few months ago." They were walking on again. Malcolm Forde had not looked backward. Was it verily Elizabeth, the woman he had loved, the woman whose image had followed him in his father's wanderings, the shadowy face looking into his, the spirit voice speaking with him, in spite of his prayer for forgetfulness, in spite of his manhood and reason? In dreams, walking and sleeping, she had been with him. Thoughts of her had intruded themselves upon his most solemn meditations. Never, even at his best, had he been free from those olden fetters, the fatal bondage of earthly love. And yet he had passed her unawares upon that mountain road, and would not for all the world go back to speak to her. A few yards farther on they met the pony carriage, the small cream-coloured ponies with bells upon their harness, the little shell-shaped carriage with its bearskin and scarlet rug. Mr. Forde smiled his bitterest smile at the sight of that dainty equipage. Was it not for pomps and vanities such as these she had sold herself? " How does she happen to be here ?" he asked his companion. " You know her? " exclaimed Mr. Mackenzie, the incumbent, turning upon him sharply. " Oh, yes, I know her." " Oh, but won't you speak to her? Let us go back. It must seem so rude to have passed her like that. And you can introduce me. I should really have liked to call on her when she first came to Slogh na Dyack, but she would naturally attend the Episcopalian church down there, I thought, and I hate the idea of seeming intrusive. Let us go back and speak to her before she drives off." " No, Mackenzie. My acquaintance with her began and ended a long time ago. I will not renew it. You must get some one else to present you, or call upon her and present yourself." " And was she Lady Paulyn when you knew her ?"" No." " Quite a nobody, I'm told, before her marriage," inquisitively. " I don't know your exact definition of a nobody. Her father was my vicar, a man of old family, and she was one of the loveliest girls, or I will say the loveliest, that I ever saw." " No doubt, no doubt. She's a splendid woman now. But it was a great match for a country clergyman's daughter. I wish my daughters may marry half as well when they grow up. Their complexions at present have a tendency to run to freckles, but I daresay they'll grow out of that." The pony carriage flashed rapidly by at this moment, Elizabeth driving and looking neither to the right nor left. " How do they come to be here ?" asked Malcolm. What, didn't I tell you yesterday when I took you for that long round? No, by the by, we did not go near Slogh na Dyack. Lord Paulyn has lately bought a place on the coast here, a charming place which he got for a dead bargain. We'll go over and call to-morrow, if you like." " Haven't I told you that I don't want to renew my acquaintance with Lady Paulyn?" " That sounds so ungracious. Your old vicar's daughter, too. However, I suppose you have your own reasons." " I have. It's best to tell you the plain truth, perhaps, only mind it goes no farther, not even to Mrs. Mackenzie. Miss Luttrell and I were engaged to be married, and she flung me over for Lord Paulyn. That's the whole story. It's a thing of the remote past, a folly on both sides, no doubt, since she was created by nature to adorn the position she now occupies, and I had other hopes which I was willing to abandon for her sake. Do not think that I cherish any ill feeling against her, only it might pain us both to meet again." Mr. Mackenzie held his peace after this, and the two men made a circuit of the hillside, and returned to the manse to dine on a cold roast of beef, as Mrs. Mackenzie called it, and a salad in clerical fashion, content to consume their viands cold on the day of rest. But Mr. Mackenzie had a budget of news for his wife that night when they retired to their own chamber, and dutifully poured into her listening ear the story of Malcolm Forde's love affair. End of Book 3, Chapter 5.